Following the treaty, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763 in October of that year, which would outline the division and administration of the newly conquered territory. It included in its provisions a reservation of lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, reserving it for the Indian population, a provision that was largely ignored by many who sought to claim lands in the West that had been promised by various colonial officials as a bounty for joining in on the war effort. Those pushing westward found Native Americans ready to block them. When a loose confederation of native tribes, primarily from the Great Lakes, Illinois, and Ohio areas, began an uprising called Pontiac's Rebellion to drive British soldiers and settlers out of the region. Hostilities came to an end within a year, but peace negotiations took longer. Warfare on the frontier had been brutal, and the killing of prisoners, the targeting of civilians, and other atrocities had been widespread. The ruthlessness and treachery of the conflict was a reflection of the growing divide between the separate populations of the British colonists and Native Americans, and it's part of the reason why the proclamation had been issued in the first place. As the wars for empire had been so expensive, the British government sought to raise revenue from the colonies to pay for their continued protection. The British Parliament had long before passed navigation acts that limited colonial trade, including having requirements that some goods could only be sold to England or that ships or crews had to be of all British or colonial origin. But these laws, passed as early as the 1650s, had often been ignored. Britain, though, sought to keep all the benefits of trade within the empire and wanted to minimize the loss of gold and silver to foreigners, essentially putting into law an economic policy known as mercantilism, whereby colonies were expected to provide benefits to the mother country. George III, though, sought to make some changes. One of the first laws passed under the new policy was the Sugar Act in 1764, which would replace the much earlier Molasses Act from 1733. The old law had placed a tax of 6 pence or 6 pennies per gallon on molasses imported into the colonies. The new one would cut that in half, but this time it would actually be enforced. The colonists objected to it, although primarily because of an economic depression that was going on at the time it was enacted. They didn't really object to the taxation itself, because it still followed the old format of taxing merchants and shippers. But they didn't really like that Parliament was using its taxation powers not just for the regulation of trade, but for actively raising revenue with the law. And still, though, smuggling would continue. A second law passed by Parliament during this period of increasing tension was the Quartering Act, passed because during the French and Indian War, many commanders had found it difficult to get colonial legislatures to pay for the quartering or the housing and provisioning of troops as they moved about the colonies, even in the midst of war. Since the colonies were seen as important now and militias were too amateur to provide for defense, a standing army would be kept there during peacetime, something that had never before been done. The law provided that troops would be kept in barracks and public houses, but if not enough space was available, they could be quartered in inns or the homes of people involved in certain businesses, barns, and even other buildings, which the owners did not need to consent to, and the colonies would have to pay for the costs. All the colonies, except for Pennsylvania, would find ways to circumvent the law, and later the law would be expanded to include any private home.